Welcome, everybody, into the July 18th edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, which I believe, David, is the 500th episode of the Locked On Leafs podcast. You came in about halfway through, a little more than halfway through, but I've been there the whole 500 eps, and I'm surprised that we got this far, man. It's actually insane, 500 episodes. So we'll chat a little bit about that. But more importantly, a couple of signings made over the weekend. Pierre Engvall signing an extension avoiding arbitration. And then they bring in Calle Jarnkrok on a 4-year contract. So we'll talk about those two ads and maybe what that signals for the Maple Leafs going forward. Also, Matthew Knies killing it at development camps. We'll chat about that as well on today's 500th edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, your one-stop shop for all things Leafs. I'm your host, Mike DiStefano from TSN 1050 Toronto Radio, also known as Al's brother on TSN's Overdrive and TSN 1050's Leafs Lunch. Joining me, it's my co-host, Dave Morassutti from Sportsnet, also a writer for the NHLPA. Locked On Leafs is a daily Maple Leafs-centric podcast, which now has produced 500 episodes, David. This is episode 500. So for those who have been here for the long run, to those who just maybe this is your first time tuning into the show, thank you so much for giving us a shot. We do podcasts each and every day throughout the season, and at least 3 days a week throughout the off season. We're going to drop the 3 days a week starting next week, but still some stuff to go through this week on the podcast. You can also catch it via video form up on YouTube, and then audio form wherever you get your podcast from. All right, Dave. Well, geez. I mean, when did you come around? You got here, what, February you started, about February?
Beginning of February, yeah.
Yeah, February or so. So you've been in it for the last couple of months. I got in it before Sheldon Keefe. Mike Babcock was still the head coach of the Maple Leafs when I started this podcast. And here we are. We've made it 500 episodes. I'd like to thank everyone, I guess, for tuning in, and also everybody who's joined as a guest along the way. So pretty sweet. Also, special shout out to Andrew Zuber, the Zoobs, who was the original co-host with me when we first started this podcast. So shout out to him. Recently had a kid, married, and so he's busy man. But you and I got the reins from here on out, and we got a little bit of juice to squeeze out of from Leafs Nation from this past weekend. Before we get into it, though, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered with this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. All right, David. So the Leafs went into the weekend with a little bit of cap space and come out with basically zero cap space and are actually over the cap as we sit here right now, which means there's going to be some movement of some kind. Somebody is going to get traded. It's just a matter of who. We'll get into that in a little bit. Why don't we talk about the players who signed over the weekend? We'll start with Calle Jarnkrok, though, because he signed as a free agent Friday, 4 years, $2.1 million per season. Last year was a guy who was picked up in the expansion draft to Seattle and then was traded to Calgary. But a pretty solid, versatile piece. He can play wing, he can play center, very good defensively, could chip in a little bit of offense. What'd you think of the signing, Dave?
Yeah, I was a little surprised to see him get 4 years, but then I heard, I can't remember where I saw it, but somebody said that he had interest from other teams, and that's what kind of made the 4 years the sticking point for the Leafs in this. And of course, people mentioned the Kyle Dubas connections. He used to represent him as an agent, so there was some the history between these guys. And Dubas, I think, also tried to pick him up at some point at the trade deadline. I don't know if it was this year's trade deadline. It might have been.
I did hear that was potentially could have been the case. It would have made sense. A depth forward for the club would have made some sense.
Yeah, and I mean, just reading a lot of what the analytics people have been saying, very good defensive player. Offensively, the last few years hasn't really been the best offensive player, but at the same time, he's not really been put into offensive situations. So he's a guy who thrives on defense. The Leafs, I feel like they're doing something very similar with what will have with Zach Hyman. Zach Hyman leaves for just over $5 million. What do the Leafs do? They reinvest in that and grab a bunch of guys in different spots. Ilya Mikheyev leaves for about 4.75. Let's bring in a couple of guys that can kind of fill in that role that Ilya Mikheyev left. And the thing that you mentioned about Calle Jarnkrok is that he can also play center.
Yeah.
And the Leafs have really missed, they've had guys
right shot center at that.
What was that?
He's a right shot center at that. So kind of what you could send out Jason Spezza, who's a right shot center. He's gone. So you're also doing that, right? So there's some versatility in this player.
I don't think people realize how important that is. Like when you're sending a guy who's going to take a face off on a strong side on a certain spot on the ice. Yeah. That's why Jason Spezza was put into certain situations because A, he was good on the draws, and B, he was a right shot. So, yeah, I didn't even consider that at first. So, yeah, just a lot of projections are saying he's a guy that's very smart, isn't going to be taking a lot of penalties. And look, the offense thing, David Kampf was seen as a guy who could not put up any offense. And he came in here and showed, you know what, maybe there's a little bit more to his game than just defense.
Yeah, would he scored 10 times the amount of goals the year before?
Yeah.
Technically.
It's something to be said that maybe just, see how this guy fits in with the Leaf system. They don't want guys to just be purely defensive. They want them to have a little bit of offense to their game.
Yeah, and I think that he has enough offense to his game, right? Like you look at last season, he scored 12 goals in 49 games before going to Calgary. Didn't quite get it going when he was with the Flames. Didn't end up scoring a goal until he got one in the playoffs, but didn't score at all in the 17 final games of the regular season. But he's a guy who could put up anywhere for roughly 15 goals. If he could put up 15 goals as a third liner, I think that you're doing okay. And that's where I think that he fits best is a third line checking role. And all of a sudden, I know that there's some out there that are saying, oh, this looks like the team's fourth line center. This is the Spezza replacement. I think it's more likely that he's the third line right winger. And then you also bring in Pierre Engvall, who they extended. We'll get to that in a second. But now you've got Engvall, Kampf, and Calle Jarnkrok. To me, that's a pretty good checking line, like a good third line that'll be very defensively driven. And I think that that'll be pretty successful. And then each of those three you can kind of count on to score you 10 to 15 goals apiece.
Yeah, for sure. Like you're not expecting them to lead the charge offensively. You want to see a little bit of offensive production from that line just because, it forces other teams to kind of think about that when it comes to matchups. But yeah, no, I think it's easy when we look at where the Leafs' biggest changes have been. Of course, it's going to be in the bottom six because that's where most of the interchangeable parts come out, right? A lot of contending teams are usually only making those changes to the bottom of the lineup. The top of the lineup generally will stay the same unless a trade happens. So these moves aren't surprising me. And you hear some of the names, like when I saw Calle Jarnkrok, I'm like, okay, that kind of makes sense. I know some people didn't like the cap number, but when you're getting a guy for 4 years, that's what it's going to cost, right? The more years you buy, the more that you're going to pay in the cap hit. And a lot of the analysis have said that he actually came in below what some of the projections.
Well, at 30, you could even argue kind of the opposite at that point. You're buying down your cap hit a little bit by giving the term. So you can even say it's opposite, actually, in the case of a 30-year-old free agent like Calle Jarnkrok. So if you're upset by the 4-year term, they also could have done it, not only because there was competition and there was a bit of a bidding war process, but also, 3 years at 2.5 or 4 years at 2.1. That may have been the situation that the Leafs were in. So they said, okay, we'll give the extra year. He's only 30. He plays a reasonably sound game where we think he could translate for the next 3 to 4 years while this team is still in a winning window. So, I like it. I think it's a pretty savvy, pretty good signing. I wouldn't expect the world from him offensively, but 15 or so goals this season. He could kill penalties. Take face-offs if need be, right shot, like I said. So there's a lot of versatility to Calle Jarnkrok. And to me, I think that he makes a certain player expendable. We'll get to that in just a moment here, Dave. Before we do, though, I do want to tell the good folks about one of today's show sponsors, and that's betonline.net. It's your number one source for all your bet needs and sports information. Find all the latest sport developments, league reviews, and news now on BetOnline. It is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, golf, and even Major League Baseball. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano. Got Dave Morassutti here. We're the co-host of Locked On Leafs. It's the 500th edition, David. 500 shows deep. Locked On Leafs has been on the air. So once again, a resounding thanks to everybody who's been along for the ride and listened to even one episode. Much appreciated. Feels good. So we'll get to what I believe the Jarnkrok signing could mean for the future of this club in a second. But we also had another signing kind of come through yesterday, just ahead of the 5 o'clock arbitration filing. List was finalized. Pierre Engvall decides to re-sign with the Maple Leafs as opposed to electing to go to arbitration. The number comes in at a one-year deal, $2.25 million extension for Pierre Engvall. There are a lot of Engvall haters out there, a lot of them. I don't know where you stand on it. I think you're probably in the middle, where you don't think he's great, but you don't think that he's bad. I am very much more of an Engvall stan than you are, I would say. Like, I think Engvall is a terrific player. And a third liner, I'm not, maybe $250,000 extra. Like, I would prefer $2 million, but 2.25, I'm perfectly okay with it. He's a guy who can, play up and down your lineup if need be. He has tremendous exits out of the zone. He's got speed. He doesn't play a lot of bully ball, which a lot of people want to see him bully people in the puck, given that he's his 6'5" frame. And he doesn't do that a whole lot. But outside of that, I like his aggressiveness with his stick. He's got a great stick, which I think is underrated and key. And Engvall is a tremendous forechecker, back checker. And like I was saying before, Engvall, Kampf, and Jarnkrok, I think, will be a tremendous forechecking third line, back-checking third line, a defensive shutdown third line. It worked last year for him with Mikheyev or Cash at times. I think that Jarnkrok could come in and be just as good defensively, and they've got themselves a shutdown third line, which is something that Sheldon Keefe has always wanted. He's always really wanted that. Remember when Hyman was here? He tried so hard to not have to put Hyman up on the top two lines because he wanted that shutdown line. Well, I think these three can definitely bring it for Toronto. And at 2.25, a hair much potentially, but ultimately, I like Pierre Engvall. I think he's a pretty quality player and somebody who they've drafted, developed, and are going to keep around. And he'll be a factor in this team's top six.
Yeah, I don't necessarily. I'm not a huge fan of Engvall. I'm also not one of the guys who really hates him. You're pretty much right when you say I'm kind of in the middle. I like what he brings 5-on-5 on offense. I think he had 12 of his 15 goals at 5-on-5, so it's clearly a guy that can produce at 5-on-5. His defense has improved. I get it that he's a guy that with that size, you want to see him get a little more physical, but he has always been known to be a finesse guy. His skating has always been his biggest strength. But what I think with the contract here, I think what happened is Engvall was going to go for arbitration. There was almost everybody was expecting it. So the Leafs probably went to him and said, look, what's it going to take to avoid this going to arbitration? He said, first off, I want a 1-year deal. That takes him to UFA. And he's like, I probably want 2.25, right? The Leafs will do that because an arbitrator could look and say, this guy might be worth $3 million or even more than that. Like, there's a certain number that the Leafs I think even you mentioned it before when we were talking about this, is that I think over a certain amount, like 4.5,
It's
the
got to
Leafs,
be, it's got to be up over $4 million in order for Leafs to walk away from it.
yeah,
Like, basically what you're saying is, for those who are unaware of the arbitration process, if he elected to go to arbitration, now the Leafs still would have time to try and figure out a deal up
yeah,
until arbitration, but they would have set a hearing date. And if they wouldn't have come up with some sort of deal in between that time, they
yeah,
go to arbitration, they exchange each other's findings, and they make an argument for how much each other should make, or how much they believe they should make. The Leafs will say, we believe we should pay him this. Engvall and his camp in the NHLPA should say he should be making this. And the thought process behind it for the Maple Leafs to sign him at 2.25 is, well, if we go to arbitration, there's a good chance that they could elect and find comparables in and around the $3 million range. It was the same reason why they elected not to sign to qualify Andre Kasha, because they felt the exact same thing could happen with an arbitrator. So in order to make sure that they have that cost certainty, that it wasn't upwards of a $3 million awarding for Pierre Engvall, they kind of met him in the middle and paid him a little bit more than they wanted to at 2.25, but it's still less than what an arbitrator most likely would have given him. So that's kind of why we see this number being a hair above. I'm glad you brought that up, because I forgot. I meant to go through that whole thing. I'm glad you brought that up so we could clarify for those who maybe aren't too happy about it or weren't really sure how the process went. That's kind of how it goes, and why Engvall is maybe a tad over what you expected it to come in at. It's because he had what's the word I'm looking? He had a lot of leverage and negotiating power because of the arbitration.
And that's what arbitration's all for, right? Is to give these RFAs a little bit of negotiating power, because the Leafs could have just said, oh, we're just going to wait and see, and then kind of leave Pierre Engvall in the dark. Arbitration kind of helps push these along. And a signing like this, in my opinion, is not going to mean it's going to backbreak the Leafs in any way. Like this contract, like anything, I always say, like anything under 2.5 isn't really going to do much for a team like the Leafs. It's when you get above that and then term gets involved, that's where kind of you get into a little bit of trouble here. So I understand a lot of people aren't a fan of Engvall's game, but you can get a lot worse. You can get many worse players than Pierre Engvall at that number.
Oh, absolutely, you could. 100%. I mean, remember Nick Ritchie was a $2.5 million player a year ago?
Well, there you go.
There
Like,
could
which
be worse
player
players.
would you rather have?
I would rather take a third liner who is willing to, forecheck, get it. Now, when I say forecheck, a lot of people, they want to see him go in and lay a big body check to separate a guy from the puck. But the guy comes in and he'll just like skate through a guy's stick instead, or he'll go in and he'll just kind of poke the puck, and like he just does a lot of good stick work. And a lot of times players, they'll try like a secondary forecheck, so they'll try and get the puck out, and he's got a good active stick to either break up a breakout pass, or someone tries to saucer it across the ice and he can knock it at midair. He did that a lot this year, and that kept some more offensive plays alive for that third line. And when I look at that third line this past year with Mikheyev, Camp, and Engvall, Mikheyev was a big part of it, and he's gone, obviously. But you just take a look as a whole at what that line specifically and what they gave up this year. Like in terms of shot attempts, and keep in mind, this line as a whole had only 34% were offensive zone starts, yet we're first, fifth, and sixth in shot attempts per 60 against. The only two forwards who had better was Matthews and Marner, and they spend half of their time in the offensive zone, 62% of offensive zone starts. So that is really important what they were able to do, apply sustained pressure, and I think that Pierre Engvall was a big part of that. Does he show up and lay the body? No. Does he score a bunch of nifty highlight reel goals? No. But he's subtly effective, and I think that is valuable. And I think Jarnkrok will be able to join those guys, and they should be able to replicate that type of success again this year. I do believe that'll be the case.
If I'm going to add one criticism to Engvall, there are times where he gets a little too overzealous to shoot the puck off the rush, and kind of just, as they call it, it's almost like a play killer. A friend of mine,
right in the buddy's chest.
Yeah, like just shoots it
He'll
at
do
the
that.
goalie's chest. Like sometimes players do that to just get an offensive zone draw. Like I do get that. Engvall tends to do that quite often, and I know that does annoy you. Want to see, try to cycle a little bit, try to gain a little zone time. But like if that's gonna be my biggest, like, a big criticism of Pierre Engvall, it's not the worst thing to be critical, like, to have as part, like, be a part of your game. I understand he's probably just trying to get that offensive zone time, get that offensive zone face off, because those are continue to be very valuable if you follow a lot of, like, the analytics and stuff.
I'll say this, though. In terms of his offensive game, he had 26 points at 5-on-5. 21 of the 26 points were primary points. So he's also a play driver in a way, not to the extent of like a top six player, but 21 out of 26 points being primary, that means you're either scoring goals or you're setting up the goals. That's pretty good. Not too shabby, I would say, from Pierre Engvall. But with these moves, like I was alluding to a moment ago, Dave, the Maple Leafs now sit $1.49 million, basically $1.5 million over the cap as they currently sit, and still have Rasmus Sandin to try and sign. How is that all going to work, Dave? How do we believe that all of this could happen? Is there a trade that's going to have to come through? Is there another signing? I don't know how exactly they're going to get under this, but why don't we talk about it on the other side of this break? Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast, your one-stop shop for all things Leafs. I'm Mike DiStefano, got Dave Morassutti with me. We're hosts here at Locked On Leafs. So as I was alluding to a moment ago, you bring in Calle Jarnkrok at $2.1 million. You re-sign Pierre Engvall at $2.25 million. And now all of a sudden, you head over the cap-friendly page, and you look at Toronto, and they're sitting there at $1.5 million over the cap. Now, you're allowed to be over the cap by 10% up until the league year starts. So it's not illegal what's going on right now. They could even still add a little bit. They could still sign, another player or sign Rasmus Sandin and still make moves afterwards. It's not like you have to make a move right now. But between now and the season ending, or the season starting rather in September, a move has to be done. Because now at the point of the guys you've signed, at the prices you've signed, they're going to be over the cap, and they need to figure out a way to get under the number of $83 million this year. David, are you of the belief that a trade is coming, and who are those players that you think are most likely to be dealt?
Yeah, this is the real tough, because a lot of people are obviously pointing at Alexander Kerfoot as the likely guy to be moved. I'm not, like, if you're gonna put a percentage on that, I'm putting like a 75% chance it's Alexander Kerfoot.
That's
The only
high.
reason, pardon?
That's high.
That's high. Well, because it's his cap hit that makes it the most obvious, because it gives the Leafs a little more breathing room. But the reason why I'm also not inclined to go like even higher, I know 75% is pretty high, but I think there's still a case where you can move out a guy like Justin Hall. And with guys being buried in the minors, you can make that cap work. I think and I'm seeing a lot of this is like people are like, oh, what's Rasmus Sandin going to sign for? The Leafs have the leverage here in a Sandin, signing. He's an RFA. Obviously, doesn't have arbitration rights. Otherwise, we would have been talking about it already. So the Leafs can take this down as long as they need to, if they need to get that number at what they want. And I think that's why we haven't heard anything yet, because the Leafs are obviously trying to figure out that number. And once they get that number, then you're like, okay, what comes next? It all depends on what Sandy's number is, and I think that will determine what move they have to make next.
Yeah, because if it comes in anything over $2 million, that will put them 3.5 over the cap, which means basically Kerfoot would have to be the guy.
Yeah.
Right. Or you'd have to play with only a 20-man roster and then also move out Hall, which you could do. The Leafs have been prone to doing that in the past before, where they've only carried, 20 guys. But that was for the last couple of seasons where at least there was a taxi squad should things occur. Don't believe we're going to see a taxi squad anymore in 22-23 because, well, luckily the world seems to be getting somewhat back to normal. And if that's the case, they don't want to be traveling shorthanded. So they would rather try and create as much cap space as possible. I'm with you where I think that Kerfoot is the most likely player to go. I believe he is probably the guy to go. I would even go higher than you. I'd say there's like a 90% chance that Kerfoot's traded throughout the offseason. And I could also look at the fact that Calle Jarnkrok signed. He does a lot of the similar things that Kerfoot brings to the team, right? What makes Kerfoot valuable is his versatility.
Yeah.
The fact that he can play on the second unit power play, he can play on the penalty kill, and he can play on the wing, and he can play down the middle. Jarnkrok can do all that too. He's not as offensively skilled as Kerfoot, I would say, but he can do all the rest of it, and he comes at a much cheaper cap hit than Kerfoot does. So if you could get an asset for him, which I spoke about this last week, he was paid out on free agent frenzy day, paid out a bonus of about $1.95 million as a signing bonus, which means he only has $750,000 of actual cash owed to him this season. There's going to be a lot of teams that would look at that and say, that's valuable. I'll bring on a $3.5 million cap hit to try and get to the floor and only have to pay him $750K. That's very valuable for a guy who can play in your middle six if you were a middle of the pack or non-contending team. I don't think he's a top six guy at a contending team, which Toronto is. So for me, when I saw the Jarnkrok signing, even before I saw the number come in through Engvall, that immediately said to me, that's kind of a Kerfoot replacement in a way. Not as much where I think he'll be the second line winger with Tavares and Nylander, but in terms of like roles on the team, he could fill in a lot of the holes that would be left if Kerfoot were traded. And that's why I thought that the Jarnkrok signing is a little bit more valuable than some are leading on to be, because I think that allows them to more easily stomach trading away Alex Kerfoot.
Yeah. And like there are two teams right now that are not even anywhere. They're not at the projected cap floor. That's, you guessed it, Arizona and Anaheim. Anaheim still has quite a few players to sign, but Arizona technically has a full roster. But they need to get to the cap. And I don't know if that's going to be where the Leafs will want to deal Kerfoot. I think they're going to try to get assets back for Kerfoot, as you've mentioned, because he does have a lot to bring to a team. Maybe not to a higher echelon contending team, but I do think there are teams that see Alexander Kerfoot, see the type of role he plays, have the cap space to make it work. I even think like a team like Seattle would benefit from a guy like Kerfoot. Just looking at the list here, Dallas has some cap space. New Jersey has always been looking for, some help on the wing. I think there's a lot of landing spots for a guy like Kerfoot. I just think the contract makes it just makes it a little too easy to kind of connect the dots on who's the one that's likely to get moved out. And I think the Leafs also just need to realize he's a year away from unrestricted free agency. Move the contract now, get some assets in return so that you're not sitting there watching him go to the Edmonton Oilers next season for whatever they're going to offer him.
You know what would also make this so much easier to stomach? If Matthew Knies was coming to the Maple Leafs next year. Because now if you move Kerfoot, who right now I would pencil in as the second line left winger. I don't like it, but that's basically who I'd be penciling in. And now if you do trade him, that's a big hole, especially since odds are you're trading him, you're getting a pick or a prospect in return. I don't think you're going to get a top six forward in return for Alex Kerfoot. If Matthew Knies had decided to return to Toronto, he would fit right there so beautifully with this team, because what this guy's doing in development camp is just unbelievable. The one-on-one board battles. I don't know if you have some of the stuff. I know Josh Cloak was tweeting out some of the visuals. Maybe we can check and see if we can pull some of them up and see some of his one-on-one drills that he was winning today. But man, they were good. And that's where I'm now thinking, okay, if they trade Kerfoot though, who becomes that second line left winger? Is that maybe an opportunity for Nick Robertson to finally get his opportunity in the top six? Okay, let's take a look at this. So for those who are here watching on YouTube, for those who are listening on podcast form, I apologize, but you can go check us out on YouTube, Locked On Leafs on YouTube. We're going to show a clip of Matthew Knies, a one-on-one drill at Leafs development camp, which kicked off today or this weekend. So why don't you go ahead and play the clip there, Dave? So Knies is in blue, number 23. Well, what happened there?
We are having some technical issues, unfortunately, with the video.
Oh, so I'm not going to be able to play it. Dang. All right. It's all good. I'll retweet it on the...
I'll try to add it in. Maybe I'll add it in on top as you talk. But if you want, like, if you've seen the video, he's bullying guys on one-on-one drills.
Yes. And that would just look so good with, like, because even like board work, like cycle work type of stuff, he would work so well with John Tavares and I think JT and Nylander. It would just look good. But he's not going to be here because he's decided that he's going to go back to university for another season. So who do you believe, if they were to move on from Kerfoot, who's ready to take that role? Nick Robertson's probably at the top of the list, no?
Yeah, he has to be. Like, it's about time that we see him take that role because that's where I had him penciled in when we started seeing him put up 50 goals in the OHL. Like, this is a guy who's going to play in a very, offensively driven role. Injuries have gone his way. I will give him that. But at some point, he's got to find a way to overcome it a little bit. Like, some of it is luck. Some of it also just, you have to find a way. But yeah, he's got to be at the top of my list. I don't know if there's another prospect on the list really that's NHL ready to take that role, because that's where I envision it. I envision it as a young player who's trying to make his spot on the team. I think that's going to be the likely outcome. Only other thing I could see is if Sheldon Keefe decides to tinker a bit with that top line and say, maybe we keep Matthews and Marner together and we move Michael Bunting down to that second line.
Why would they do that? Then who goes and plays on the top line?
You find somebody that can make it work.
I don't like that at all. I don't like that idea at all.
The only reason why I say it is because the second line was just that ineffective at times last year that you can't let your top line be the only line, really. I understand that you don't want to break that lineup. That's not my first choice.
No, I don't even think that's your second choice. Maybe not even your third choice. So you got to give a couple of guys a cup of coffee up on that line to see if they can get something going before you consider breaking up the Bunting, Matthews, and Marner line. I mean, maybe Pierre Engvall at 2.25, it'd be a lot more justifiable at that number if he's a guy who can maybe go up and play on that second line. And you brought in Nicolas Aube-Kubel, who is a really solid forechecker, third line type of player, third or fourth line type of winger. Maybe you end up going with Aube-Kubel, Kampf, and Jarnkrok as your third line, and then Engvall's that guy who slides up and can kind of be that type of player. That's something that I think would be interesting. He's got some good speed. He can break the puck into the zone and then just wait for Johnny to get in and around the net area and also can play a little bit of, not bully puck, little bit of a cycle game along with Tavares. Potentially that's an option as well on the second line. You don't love it, but it's an option, right?
This is why I just think Nick Robertson, it just seems like
he'd be option A, I think, going into training camp.
He is my top option. And we're not gifting him that opportunity. He's got to earn it, but he also should be given the opportunity to earn it too. Because I think they were trying at times to play him on the third or fourth line and see if he can push his way up. And it's almost like you got to put him in a position to succeed a little bit here. Like Michael Bunting, nobody thought he was going to. Well, there were some that thought he would work on the top line, but wasn't until.
I mean, I guess he scored 25 goals this year, but just saying.
But it wasn't until Michael Bunting was placed on that line in a full-time role that we started to see the reason.
Go back. I'm not even kidding you. This is the 500th episode of the show. Go back and listen to when I broke down the signing, because I went and I watched his goals and then all of his goals from last year, because I think it was only like 10 or 11 goals that he had scored in 21 games. And I said to myself, I don't remember if it was either when I was doing my roster projection at the beginning of the season or it was directly after that signing, but I said, this is a great player to have with Austin Matthews. I think he can legitimately play with Matthews and Marner. And I was upset when he didn't start the year with them. And then ultimately he did, and they took off. And I was like, thank you. He's just perfect. He's a guy who just is around the net, right? Someone who just went to the net and he could score. And all of his goals were either tips or they were just, rebound deflection or rebound goals in and around the net. In the same similar fashion to how JVR scored a lot of his goals. I thought that would work well with Austin Matthews, who's a shooting machine. Turned out to be correct. So don't say no one thought it wouldn't work.
I didn't say no one. I didn't say not many.
There's evidence on this podcast.
One thing, and if we want to bring this back to Matthew Knies, it's funny because we're wondering when is he going to come, and there was a tweet from Luke Fox which pretty much said Austin Matthews had reached out to him a few times since he was drafted, and pretty much the main tip he was giving him is to encourage patience. And I give him a lot of credit because he had a lot of people telling him probably a lot of different things he could have done: sign with the Leafs, go on a playoff run, or stay in school and develop. And the Leafs they were trying. Obviously, they would like to see him come, but they weren't trying to force the issue either. I also just think he might just realize he's ready if he has, he's looking well in development camp. I would assume around that time, maybe he's going to have a better idea of what his future is going to look like. But I think if it's not to start the year.
Wait. Are you saying that you believe there's a possibility that he says, actually, screw college, I think I'm ready to go pro this at the beginning of the season?
Well, I think it depends on what that conversation is like with the development staff. So I think he realizes physically he's got the physical tools to make it to the NHL. I'm wondering if it's for him. It's more so, does he think his maturity is that ready for the pro game? I think he's gonna get that idea after development camp, whether it's at the start of the season or end of the season. I do think he will make it with the Leafs at some point.
Yeah, all indication is that after the college year ends, they're hoping to have another Final Four appearance with him in Minnesota. After the college season ends, he will sign with the Maple Leafs. This typically occurs April-ish, and he's here for like the last couple of weeks of the regular season and then a playoff run. That's the expectation that we see out of Matthew Knies. It's what we would have seen this year, but he decided to go back to school. And it's what we're expecting to see this upcoming season as well. That's why when you said, I don't know, maybe we'll see him at the start, I'm like, you think that he's second guessing himself, and maybe after a strong development camp, he thinks to himself, you know what, maybe I do want to play pro hockey and start my career.
I think
what's your percentage that he is in a Maple Leafs uniform on opening night?
I'm going to put it very low at 5%. Just because
you made it sound like it was a lot higher than that. Like you were thinking it was a legitimate option.
I think he's going to realize how close he is, though. Like, we haven't, because this is the first time we're really seeing Matthew Knies with the development staff.
There wasn't one last year, right?
Right. So he's basically talking all about like the maturity of his game. I think it's close, but I think for him, he has to feel ready. And I do think, it'd be nice if he felt he was ready, but that's a personal desire because then it would make it a lot easier to fill some of these holes. But at the same time, you don't want to rush the kid and then realize, maybe we should have given a little bit more time.
Yeah. So not expecting to see him, but we are expecting to see a trade of some kind, whether it's Kerfoot or Justin Hall. We do expect to see a move to be done. Heck, maybe Sandin also could be traded because his contract isn't done yet either. Apparently, there's some contention going on between the two sides as they try and get that thing squared away. All right, Dave, fun show, good stuff. Got through a lot there, but we'll leave it there. That's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all podcast platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on Twitter at Mick_Knock. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti. And follow the show at Locked On Leafs as well. If you are on YouTube, go ahead, leave a like and comment down below what you think the Maple Leafs should do going forward. Who's the guy they should try and trade out? And then who plays on that second line with John Tavares and William Nylander if it's not Alex Kerfoot? Let us know in the comment section down below on YouTube or hit us up on Twitter to let us know your answers. All right, Dave, 500 episodes of the podcast in the books. Episode 501 will be back tomorrow. But until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.